You're about to watch a man ruin his own life in less than 5 minutes. And he has no idea it's already happening. The sound of rolling suitcase wheels echoed across the polished floor of the upscale shopping concourse just outside Terminal B, a place where everything smelled faintly of coffee and expensive perfume, where people moved fast but spoke quietly, and where nobody expected trouble to unfold in plain sight. That was exactly why Alicia Brooks stood out, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she wasn't in a hurry, her pace measured, her eyes scanning reflections in glass storefronts rather than the stores themselves, her posture calm in a way that didn't quite match the restless energy of travelers passing through. Across the hall, Ryan Cole noticed her almost immediately, though he couldn't explain why at first, only that something about her didn't fit the pattern his mind had already mapped out for everyone else in the space. Business travelers glued to phones, families juggling bags, airport staff moving with purpose. She moved like someone waiting, watching, calculating. Ryan adjusted his jacket, shifting his weight as he kept her in his peripheral vision, convincing himself that instinct alone was enough, that sometimes you just knew when something was off. And in his mind, that feeling quickly hardened into certainty. Alicia paused briefly near a digital directory, her reflection doubling in the glass as she tilted her head slightly, as if confirming something only she could see, then continued walking, her hand brushing lightly against the strap of her bag, not nervously, not casually, but deliberately. Ryan stepped forward now, closing the distance by a few yards, his heart rate ticking up not from fear, but from the rush of being right, or at least believing he was right, already rehearsing the words he would say, already picturing the attention it would draw, the validation, the moment where everyone else realized what he had seen first. Around them, the crowd flowed uninterrupted, a steady stream of rolling luggage and quiet conversations, unaware that a narrative was forming in Ryan's mind, one where he was the decisive figure. Stepping in before something worse could happen, Alicia slowed again, this time near a seating area, her gaze briefly landing on a man checking his watch 2 rows over, then shifting away just as quickly, subtle enough that no one else would notice, but Ryan caught it, or at least he thought he did, and that was all he needed. He took another step closer, his voice already rising in his throat before he fully committed, his certainty now louder than his doubt, louder than the normal hesitation that might have told him to wait, to observe a little longer, to question himself. Alicia, meanwhile, remained composed, her expression unreadable, as if she had already anticipated this exact moment long before Ryan ever decided to act, as if the tension building in the air wasn't a surprise to her at all, but part of something much larger unfolding just beneath the surface. And as Ryan finally squared his shoulders and prepared to speak, convinced he was about to expose something important, the truth was already moving quietly into position around him, unseen, irreversible, and far more consequential than he could possibly imagine. Ryan did not hesitate once the thought fully locked into place, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversations as he stepped directly into Alicia's path and said loud enough for nearby travelers to hear that he had been watching her and something was not right, that her behavior looked suspicious and someone needed to take a closer look. A few heads turned instantly, the natural curiosity of a public space pulling attention toward the tension like gravity, and within seconds the quiet flow of movement around them began to slow as people subtly adjusted their pace to listen without appearing obvious. Alicia stopped without stepping back, her expression steady, her eyes meeting Ryan's for the first time in a way that was calm but not passive, as if she were measuring him rather than reacting to him. And that lack of visible concern only pushed Ryan further into his certainty, because in his mind an innocent person would have responded differently, would have shown confusion or urgency, or at least asked what this was about. But she did none of those things. Instead, she simply said in an even tone that he should be careful with what he was implying, that public accusations had consequences, but Ryan barely registered the warning, already turning slightly to include the growing audience behind him, reinforcing his narrative with confident gestures as he explained that he had observed her watching people, moving without purpose, checking reflections instead of destinations, and that he believed she might be involved in something illegal. The word itself hung in the air, heavy enough to shift the mood from curiosity to unease, And that was all it took for the crowd to lean mentally in his direction, not because they had evidence, but because certainty spoken loudly often feels like truth in moments like this. Alicia adjusted the strap of her bag again, the same deliberate motion as before, her gaze briefly flicking past Ryan towards something behind him before returning. And if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have noticed that she was not scanning for an exit. She was confirming positions, but Ryan interpreted every movement as further proof of his claim, his confidence now feeding on itself as he raised his voice again and said that security should be involved immediately, that this was not something to ignore. A man standing near a coffee stand pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, but to record, because moments like this had a way of becoming stories people wanted to capture, and that subtle shift added another layer of pressure to the scene, turning it from a confrontation into a performance whether anyone intended it or not. Alicia finally spoke again, her voice still controlled, asking Ryan what exactly he thought she had done, giving him a chance to define his accusation clearly. But instead of pausing, Ryan doubled down, saying that people like her often tried to blend in, that he had seen enough to know when something was off, and that waiting could make things worse. And in that moment his words crossed from suspicion into something more definitive, something that could not easily be taken back. A nearby airport staff member hesitated before speaking into a radio, quietly requesting assistance. And within less than a minute, 2 uniformed security officers began making their way toward the scene, their presence subtle at first, but unmistakable as they approached with professional composure. The crowd parted just enough to give them a clear path, the atmosphere tightening as authority entered the picture, and Ryan felt a surge of validation, his posture straightening as if the arrival of security confirmed everything he had said, while Alicia remained exactly where she was, neither stepping forward nor backing away, her attention now shifting slightly past Ryan once more, catching a brief nod from someone seated across the concourse, a detail so small it disappeared into the noise of the moment. Yet it carried meaning far beyond what anyone there understood. As the officers closed the final few feet, one of them addressed both Ryan and Alicia with measured calm, asking what was going on, and Ryan immediately began explaining his version of events, speaking quickly, layering observation over assumption until it sounded cohesive enough to hold together under casual scrutiny. While Alicia listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her silence no longer passive but purposeful, as if she were allowing the situation to reach a specific point before doing anything at all, and just beneath the surface of what everyone could see. The balance of control had already begun to shift in a direction that Ryan could not yet perceive, even as he stood there convinced that everything was unfolding exactly the way he intended. The taller of the 2 security officers kept his voice even as he asked Ryan to slow down and explain clearly. And for a brief second Ryan felt the need to organize his thoughts, but instead of stepping back he leaned further in, pointing subtly toward Alicia's bag and repeating that her behavior matched patterns he had seen before, that she had been watching people, pacing without direction, and acting like she was waiting for something illegal to happen. The officer nodded without confirming or denying anything, trained to let people speak themselves into clarity, while the second officer shifted his attention toward Alicia and asked for her side of the story, giving her a direct opening to respond. Alicia did not rush to fill the silence, and that pause stretched just long enough to make the crowd lean in again, their expectations already shaped by Ryan's confidence, their assumptions quietly forming without evidence. When she finally spoke, her tone remained composed as she said that she was simply waiting for someone and that she had every right to be in the space, adding that she had not approached anyone or done anything illegal. And while her words were simple, they lacked the defensive energy people expected in moments like this, which made them feel incomplete to those listening. Ryan seized that gap immediately, saying that of course she would deny it, that this was exactly how people operated when they were trying to avoid suspicion, and his voice carried just enough urgency to keep the attention locked on him, reinforcing the narrative he had already built. One of the officers glanced briefly at Alicia's bag, not with accusation but with routine procedure, and asked if she would be willing to allow a quick check to resolve the situation, framing it as a way to clear things up quickly. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath at that moment, because this was the point where the story would either confirm Ryan's claim or collapse under its own weight. Alicia's eyes shifted again, not to the officers, not to Ryan, but slightly past them. And for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something different in her expression. Not fear, not frustration, but timing, as if she were aligning her next move with something unseen. She then looked back at the officer and said calmly that she understood the request, but asked whether there was any legal basis for it. Her question precise, not confrontational, but exact, and it landed differently than anything that had been said so far, because it introduced a level of awareness that did not match the role Ryan had assigned to her. The officer paused for half a second, acknowledging the question, explaining that they were responding to a report and simply trying to ensure everything was safe, keeping his tone neutral while avoiding escalation. Ryan, however, interpreted the hesitation as momentum slipping away and quickly stepped in again, saying that waiting was a mistake, that if she walked away now it would be too late, and his urgency began to sound less like confidence and more like insistence. Around them, the subtle dynamics of the scene started to shift in ways that were almost impossible to notice unless someone was looking for them. A man near the seating area stood up slowly and moved closer without drawing attention. Another person who had been sitting with a laptop closed it and adjusted position. And though none of these movements were dramatic, they formed a quiet pattern that Alicia seemed to track without ever turning her head fully. The officer addressed Alicia again, this time asking for identification, a standard request that carried more weight than the previous question. And Ryan exhaled slightly, believing this was the turning point he had been pushing toward. Alicia reached into her bag with deliberate care, not hurried, not hesitant, and the simple act caused a ripple through the crowd as several people leaned forward just enough to see what she would take out. Their expectations now fully aligned with the version of events Ryan had constructed, but what they could not see was that this moment had already been anticipated, that the timing of this request intersected precisely with a larger sequence unfolding beyond their awareness. And as Alicia's hand moved inside her bag, the balance of control that Ryan thought he held tightened quietly around him, setting the stage for a shift that would not just challenge his assumptions, but completely dismantle them in a way he could not yet comprehend. Alicia's hand moved slowly inside her bag, not searching but reaching with certainty, and that distinction, though invisible to most, carried weight in the way the moment unfolded. Because she was not reacting to pressure, she was following a sequence that had already been decided. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing to the opening of the bag as if the answer to everything he had claimed was about to reveal itself. And in his mind this was confirmation, the final step before being proven right, while the officer nearest to Alicia kept his posture neutral, watching carefully without stepping closer, maintaining the controlled distance that signaled authority without aggression. The second officer shifted his stance just enough to keep both Ryan and Alicia in view, ensuring that the situation remained contained, while the small crowd around them had now fully transitioned from passing observers into a quiet circle of witnesses, their attention locked in, their expectations aligned toward a reveal that they believed would validate what they had already begun to accept as truth. Alicia withdrew her hand from the bag, holding a simple leather wallet between her fingers, nothing dramatic, nothing that matched the tension that had built around the moment. And for a fraction of a second there was confusion in the air, as if the scene had skipped a beat. Ryan frowned slightly, the first crack in his certainty appearing not as doubt but as impatience, because this was not the outcome he had anticipated, and he quickly spoke again, saying that identification alone did not prove anything, that people could carry whatever they wanted, his words coming faster now, less measured, as if he needed to keep the narrative moving forward before it slowed down on its own. Alicia opened the wallet calmly and held it at a slight angle toward the officer, not flashing it quickly, not hiding it either, just presenting it with a level of control that suggested she understood exactly how much needed to be seen and by whom. And the officer leaned in just enough to read it, his eyes scanning the details in a practiced motion. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the second officer noticed immediately, their brief eye contact carrying a silent exchange that passed information without words. Ryan did not catch it, or if he did, he misinterpreted it, because he stepped in again, asking what it said, demanding clarity, his voice now edged with urgency that was harder to disguise as confidence. Alicia closed the wallet halfway, still holding it in position, and said evenly that she had already answered their questions and that this situation was based on an assumption that had escalated unnecessarily. Her tone still controlled, still measured, but now carrying a subtle firmness that had not been present before. The first officer straightened slightly and addressed Alicia with a different level of formality, asking her quietly if she would mind stepping a few feet to the side for a moment, and that shift, small as it was, changed the entire dynamic of the scene. Because it was no longer about verifying her story in front of everyone. It was about containing information. Ryan felt it immediately, even if he could not fully understand it, and he reacted by stepping closer again, saying that there was no reason to move aside, that everything should be handled right there in the open. His insistence now beginning to feel out of place against the controlled professionalism of the officers. Around them, the subtle movements that had started earlier continued to align. The man who had stood up before was now positioned closer to the edge of the group. Another individual had shifted to block a clear line of sight from one side of the concourse. And though no one announced these changes, they formed a quiet perimeter that was not accidental. Alicia glanced briefly toward one of those positions, her expression unchanged, but the timing of that glance matched the officer's request perfectly, as if both were part of the same unspoken coordination. The second officer then turned slightly toward Ryan, his tone still calm, but more directive now, asking him to give them a moment to sort things out. And for the first time since this began, Ryan was being asked to step back instead of step forward. That request landed harder than anything else, because it disrupted the role he had placed himself in, and for a split second he hesitated, caught between pushing further and recognizing that the situation was no longer moving under his control. Alicia, still holding the wallet, shifted her stance just enough to follow the officer's indication, not away from the scene, but into a position where the next move would no longer be public. And as she did, the carefully balanced tension that had carried Ryan forward began to tilt in a direction he could not yet see clearly, but one that was already moving beyond his reach. Ryan did not like being asked to step back, and the moment that request left the officer's mouth, something in his posture stiffened, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted just enough to make him unstable. But instead of recalibrating, he leaned harder into the role he had already chosen, insisting that he had a right to know what was going on, that he had been the one to raise the concern, and that this should not suddenly become private. The officer maintained his composure, repeating calmly that they needed a moment to verify information and that Ryan's cooperation would help resolve things faster. And while the words were neutral, the tone carried a subtle authority that was no longer optional. Alicia, meanwhile, had already taken a small step to the side, aligning herself with the officer's position without hesitation, her movements precise and unhurried, as if she were following instructions that had been anticipated rather than given. And when she adjusted the wallet in her hand again, it was clear that what she had shown moments earlier was only part of what needed to be communicated. The officer closest to her lowered his voice slightly, asking a brief question that did not carry across the crowd, and Alicia responded just as quietly, her words measured, her eye contact steady, and whatever she said caused the officer's expression to settle into something more definitive, a recognition that replaced uncertainty with confirmation. The second officer shifted his stance again, this time creating a more deliberate separation between Ryan and Alicia, not aggressively, but with a positioning that made it clear where each person was expected to stand, and that subtle boundary was enough to signal that the situation was no longer a public debate, but a controlled interaction. Ryan exhaled sharply, glancing around at the onlookers as if searching for reinforcement. But the energy of the crowd had begun to change, the earlier curiosity now mixed with hesitation, because the dynamic no longer matched the story he had been telling. And without realizing it, the audience that had quietly supported his certainty was beginning to pull back. Alicia reached into the wallet once more, and this time removed a second item, smaller, more discreet, and she held it in a way that shielded it from the wider crowd while still allowing the officer a clear view. And the effect was immediate, not in volume or drama, but in the way the officer's posture adjusted, his shoulders straightening slightly as he gave a subtle nod. There was no announcement, No visible reaction for the crowd to latch onto. Just a quiet shift in understanding between two people who were now operating on a level of information that excluded everyone else present. Ryan noticed the change but could not interpret it. And that gap between observation and understanding created a flicker of unease that he quickly tried to override by speaking again, asking what that was, demanding transparency, his voice rising. Just enough to pull a few more glances from the crowd. But this time the attention felt different, less supportive, more uncertain. The officer turned toward Ryan again, his tone still calm, but now more structured, asking him to lower his voice and allow them to complete their process. And while the words were simple, they carried a finality that had not been present before, a signal that the situation was moving forward with or without his approval. Alicia closed the wallet and held it at her side, her focus no longer on Ryan at all, but on the officers and the subtle cues around them. And in that moment it became clear, at least to those paying close attention, that she was not reacting to the situation, she was guiding it toward a specific outcome. Across the concourse, the individuals who had shifted positions earlier now appeared even more deliberate in their placement, one standing near an exit path, another positioned where they could observe both the officers and the crowd. And though their presence remained understated, it formed a quiet framework that supported whatever was about to happen next. Ryan, still standing just outside the space that had been created, felt the distance. More than he expected, not physical distance, but a separation from the control he believed he had. And as he opened his mouth to speak again, searching for a way to regain that control, the realization began to form, faint but undeniable, that the situation was no longer unfolding according to his assumptions, and that whatever came next would not be something he could steer back in his favor. The space between Ryan and the officers did not look like much to anyone passing by, just a few feet of polished floor, but in that moment it might as well have been a wall, because everything that mattered was now happening just beyond his reach. And for the first time since he spoke up, he was no longer the center of the situation. The officer closest to Alicia gave a small, almost imperceptible nod after seeing the second item in her wallet, then adjusted his stance so that his body naturally blocked the direct line of sight from the crowd, a subtle move that did not draw attention but clearly shifted the interaction into a more controlled exchange. Alicia slipped the item back into her wallet and held it closed in one hand, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her attention focused not on the tension around her but on the timing of what came next. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have realized that she was not waiting for permission, she was waiting for alignment. The second officer brought his hand up to his radio, pressing the button with a calm efficiency and speaking in a low voice that did not carry beyond a few feet, requesting a status check in terms that sounded routine to an outsider, but carried a level of precision that did not match the situation Ryan believed he had uncovered. There was a brief pause, no more than 2 seconds, before a response came through, quiet and controlled, and whatever was said caused the officer's expression to settle into something firm, something resolved. Ryan shifted his weight again, glancing from one officer to the other, then back to Alicia, trying to read the moment, trying to regain some sense of footing, but the cues he had relied on earlier were no longer available to him, replaced by a calm, coordinated rhythm that he did not understand. He spoke again, this time with less volume but more insistence, asking what was happening, why no one was explaining anything, and whether they were actually going to address the concern he had raised. And though his words were still confident, there was a thin edge beneath them now, a strain that had not been there before. The officer nearest to him turned slightly, meeting his gaze with a measured look and saying that they were handling the situation and that he needed to remain where he was for the moment. And the phrasing, simple as it was, carried a shift in tone that Ryan could not ignore, because it placed him not as the one initiating action, but as someone being managed within it. Alicia took a small step forward, aligning herself more directly with the officers, and as she did, the individuals positioned around the concourse seemed to settle into place, their earlier movements now forming a quiet structure that framed the scene without drawing attention, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into alignment. One of them adjusted his position near a corridor leading toward the terminal gates. Another angled slightly to maintain a clear view of both the officers and Ryan. And though no one spoke, The coordination was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Alicia glanced briefly toward one of those positions again, and this time the acknowledgement was clearer, a fraction of a second longer, enough to confirm that whatever had been set in motion was now fully in place. The officer who had used the radio lowered his hand and spoke quietly to Alicia, asking a short question that did not carry, and she responded with a single sentence, her tone even, her words precise, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but definitive. The second officer then shifted his attention back to Ryan, his posture now more formal, his voice steady as he said that they needed to clarify a few things with him as well, and that simple statement landed differently than anything before it, because it subtly redefined his role in the situation from observer to participant. Ryan blinked, processing the shift, his mind trying to reconcile how the focus had moved without him noticing the exact moment it happened, and for the first time a real question formed beneath his confidence, not about Alicia, but about whether he had misunderstood something fundamental. The crowd, sensing the change even if they could not articulate it, began to lose its earlier cohesion, some people stepping back, others lowering their phones, the energy dispersing as the narrative they had been drawn into no longer followed the expected path. Alicia remained still, composed, no longer the subject of scrutiny, but part of the structure guiding it. And as the officers subtly adjusted their positions once more, the balance of control that Ryan thought he had claimed at the beginning had fully transitioned into something else entirely, something deliberate, coordinated, and far beyond the assumptions that had started it all. Ryan felt the shift before he could fully understand it. Like the air in the concourse had changed pressure without warning, and suddenly every word he had said earlier began to echo differently in his own mind, not as confident observations, but as statements that now needed to be explained. The officer standing closest to him did not raise his voice or step forward, but the way he held eye contact carried a new level of expectation, and when he spoke, it was no longer about what Alicia had done, it was about what Ryan had claimed, asking him to walk through exactly what he had seen when he had first noticed her, and what made him certain enough to escalate the situation in a public space. Ryan opened his mouth immediately, ready to repeat the same sequence. But this time the words did not land the same way, because now they were being measured, not accepted, and as he described her movements again, the pacing, the way she looked at reflections, the pauses, he could hear how each detail sounded on its own, how none of them actually confirmed anything beyond his interpretation. Alicia remained just a few feet away, her presence steady, her attention no longer on Ryan at all, but on the quiet coordination unfolding around her. And when she shifted her stance slightly, it was not to react, but to maintain alignment with the officers and the individuals positioned across the concourse. One of those individuals, the man who had moved earlier from the seating area, now adjusted his jacket sleeve in a subtle motion that would have gone unnoticed to most, but Alicia caught it immediately, her eyes flicking in that direction for a fraction of a second before returning to neutral. And that single exchange confirmed that whatever operation had been in motion was still proceeding exactly as planned. Ryan, still speaking, began to feel the need to fill gaps that he had not noticed before, adding small assumptions to connect his observations, saying that her behavior matched patterns he had read about, that it did not feel random, that it looked coordinated, and with each addition, his explanation stretched further from fact into interpretation. The officer listened without interruption, letting the full explanation unfold, and when Ryan finished, there was a brief pause. That felt longer than it actually was, because for the first time no one rushed to respond. No one validated or challenged him immediately, leaving his words suspended in the air without support. Then the officer asked a simple question, whether Ryan had seen Alicia interact with anyone directly, exchange anything, or engage in any action that could be clearly defined as illegal. And the clarity of that question cut through everything Ryan had built, because it narrowed the situation down to something objective. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough, because the answer was not there, not in the way the question required. And he tried to pivot, saying that not all actions were obvious, that sometimes you had to act before something happened. But even as he said it, the certainty in his voice had softened. Around them, the crowd had thinned further, the earlier sense of collective attention dissolving into scattered curiosity. people now more interested in moving on than staying, because the tension no longer promised the kind of clear outcome they had expected. Alicia took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, and then, for the first time since the officers had shifted their focus, she spoke again, her voice calm, addressing the officer rather than Ryan, saying that she had been waiting for a signal and that the timing had been disrupted, her words carefully chosen, not revealing everything, but enough to confirm that her actions had purpose beyond what had been assumed. The officer gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without expanding on it, and then turned back to Ryan, explaining that while concerns could be reported, making public accusations without clear evidence could create unnecessary complications, his tone still professional, but now carrying a subtle weight of accountability. Ryan felt that weight immediately, the realization settling in that the situation had moved beyond his control, not because something had gone wrong, but because he had misread it from the beginning. And as he stood there trying to reconcile that shift, the structure around him tightened just enough to make it clear that what happened next would not be driven by his assumptions, but by a reality he had only just begun to glimpse. Ryan stood there with the weight of that question still lingering in his mind, the one he could not answer cleanly, and for the first time since this began, he became aware of how quiet everything around him had gotten, not because the space was empty, but because the attention that had once fueled his certainty had faded into something distant and uncertain. The officer did not rush to fill the silence, allowing it to settle, allowing Ryan to sit with the gap between what he believed and what he could actually prove, and in that space, the difference became harder to ignore. Alicia remained composed, her posture steady, her presence no longer framed as suspicious but as intentional, and when she slightly shifted her weight, it was not in reaction to Ryan but in alignment with something beyond him, something that was continuing to move forward regardless of his involvement. One of the individuals positioned near the edge of the concourse took a few steps closer, not directly into the center of attention, but enough to be within quiet speaking distance of the officers, and as he approached, the officer nearest to Alicia acknowledged him with a brief glance that carried recognition rather than surprise. The man did not interrupt, did not announce himself. He simply positioned himself where he needed to be, his eyes scanning the area once before settling on Alicia for a fraction of a second, and in that brief exchange, there was an understanding that did not need words. Ryan noticed the movement but could not place its significance, and that uncertainty added to the growing discomfort that was replacing his earlier confidence. He attempted to speak again, this time more controlled, saying that he was only trying to help, that he had acted out of concern for safety, and while the words were reasonable on the surface, they no longer carried the same authority they had before, because the context around them had changed. The officer nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without affirming it, and then asked Ryan if he understood the difference between observing behavior and assigning intent. The question simple but precise, and it landed in a way that made it difficult to respond without reconsidering everything that had been said. Ryan hesitated again, longer this time, his thoughts no longer moving as quickly as they had at the beginning, because now each answer felt like it needed to be exact, needed to be grounded in something more than instinct. And that was not the position he had expected to be in. Alicia took a small step forward, closing the distance between herself and the officers just enough to speak quietly, her voice low, her words measured, and though the content of what she said did not carry to the surrounding crowd, the effect was immediate in the way the officers adjusted, their posture aligning more closely with hers, their focus sharpening. The man who had approached earlier gave a subtle nod, confirming whatever had just been communicated, and then shifted his attention outward, scanning the concourse again with a level of awareness that suggested he was not there by chance. Ryan felt the shift again, more clearly this time, not just in tone but in structure, as if the entire situation had reorganized itself around a purpose he had not been aware of, and in that realization, a new thought began to form, one that he did not want to fully accept, that he might not just be mistaken, but that his actions had interfered with something already in progress. The officer turned back to him once more, his tone still calm, but now carrying a clarity that left little room for interpretation, explaining that while reporting concerns was not wrong, making assumptions without evidence could lead to unnecessary complications, especially in environments where multiple processes might already be underway. The phrasing was careful, not revealing specifics, but enough to signal that there was more happening than Ryan had considered. The crowd had now mostly dispersed, the earlier sense of spectacle dissolving into normal activity, leaving only a few lingering observers who watched with quiet curiosity, but no longer with expectation. Alicia stood at the center of the remaining space, no longer the subject of scrutiny, but part of the structure guiding it, her presence steady, her timing precise. And as she glanced briefly toward the man who had joined them, then back to the officers, it became clear that whatever came next was not a reaction to Ryan at all, but the continuation of something that had been in motion long before he ever decided to speak. The rhythm of the space had returned to something that looked almost normal on the surface. Travelers continuing toward their gates, rolling suitcases passing by, quiet conversations resuming. But within the small pocket where Ryan stood, everything had fundamentally changed, and the difference was no longer subtle. The officer nearest to Alicia took a half-step closer to the man who had approached earlier, and though their voices remained low, the exchange between them was direct, efficient, and clearly based on shared understanding rather than explanation. And when it ended, the man gave a slight nod before shifting his attention outward again, positioning himself in a way that suggested he was now part of the active structure rather than an observer. Alicia remained still, her posture composed, her focus steady, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm but carried a level of authority that had not been fully visible before, as she said that the timing window had narrowed and that any further delay could affect the outcome. Her words precise, measured, and clearly intended for the officers rather than Ryan. The officer acknowledged her statement with a brief nod, then brought his hand back to the radio, speaking quietly but with a tone that indicated confirmation rather than inquiry, as if he were updating rather than requesting, and within seconds a response came through that seemed to finalize whatever sequence had been unfolding behind the scenes. Ryan watched all of this without understanding the language of it. The subtle cues, the quiet confirmations, the way decisions were being made without discussion, and the realization that he was no longer part of the process settled more heavily with each passing second. He shifted his stance, his earlier confidence now replaced by a need to make sense of what was happening, and he spoke again, asking directly what was going on, his voice lower now, less performative, more searching, as if he were finally asking a question instead of making a statement. The officer turned toward him, his expression neutral but no longer as open, and explained that the situation involved matters that could not be discussed publicly, that what Ryan had interpreted as suspicious behavior was in fact part of an ongoing process, and while the explanation was limited, it carried enough weight to change the meaning of everything that had happened. Ryan felt that shift immediately, the words settling into place in a way that forced him to reevaluate every assumption he had made. And for a moment he did not respond, because the implication was clear even if the details were not, that he had not uncovered something, he had interrupted it. Alicia glanced toward him briefly, not with frustration or judgment, but with a calm acknowledgement, as if recognizing that his role in the situation had already been accounted for, and then her attention returned to the officers, her focus moving forward without hesitation. The man positioned near the corridor raised his hand slightly, a small signal that passed almost invisibly between him and Alicia, and she responded with the faintest nod, confirming alignment. And in that instant the structure that had been forming around them became fully active, not in a dramatic way, but in a coordinated shift that set multiple points in motion at once. One individual moved toward the seating area, another adjusted position near the exit path. And though their actions appeared casual to anyone passing by, they formed a deliberate pattern that extended beyond the immediate scene. The officer who had been speaking with Ryan stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear path forward for Alicia, and as she began to move, her pace remained measured, her posture unchanged, but the purpose behind it was unmistakable. She was no longer waiting, she was executing. Ryan watched her take those first steps, the distance between them growing not just physically but contextually. And in that widening gap, the final piece of understanding began to settle into place, that the situation he thought he had controlled was never his to control at all, and that everything unfolding now had been set in motion long before he ever decided to speak. As Alicia moved further into the concourse, flanked subtly by the individuals who had revealed themselves through their positioning, the officers maintained their composure, allowing the flow of the space to absorb the movement without disruption. And Ryan remained where he was, standing at the edge of something he had misread from the very beginning, watching as the reality of the situation continued forward without him, leaving behind a silence that carried more clarity than anything that had been said out loud. Alicia moved with a steady, deliberate pace that did not draw attention to itself, yet everything around her seemed to adjust in response, as if the flow of the concourse subtly bent to accommodate her path, and the individuals who had previously blended into the environment now revealed their coordination through timing rather than visibility, each one maintaining a natural distance while staying aligned with her direction. Ryan remained where he was, watching the distance grow, his mind still trying to reconcile how quickly the narrative had shifted away from him, and the realization that he was no longer part of whatever was unfolding created a quiet tension that replaced the urgency he had felt earlier. The officer closest to him did not follow Alicia immediately, instead staying back for a moment as if to ensure that nothing further disrupted the situation, and when he spoke again, his tone was calm, but carried a finality that made it clear the conversation with Ryan was nearing its end, explaining that there was no further action required from him, and that he was free to continue on his way. The words were simple, but they landed heavily, because they confirmed what Ryan had already begun to understand, that his role in this moment was over, and that whatever importance he had assigned to himself at the beginning had dissolved completely. Ryan nodded slightly, though the motion felt automatic rather than intentional, and he glanced once more in Alicia's direction, watching as she moved deeper into the concourse, now accompanied more closely by the man who had approached earlier, their interaction minimal but clearly coordinated, their focus forward rather than on anything behind them. The second officer remained nearby, his attention briefly scanning the surrounding area before stepping back into the normal rhythm of the space. His presence no longer central now that the situation had transitioned into something beyond public view. As Alicia continued forward, she reached a point near the corridor leading toward the terminal gates, and there, the subtle structure that had formed around her tightened just enough to create a controlled environment without disrupting the natural flow of people, a balance that required precision and awareness that went unnoticed by most. The man at her side spoke quietly, his words brief and direct, and Alicia responded with a slight nod, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering, and though the content of their exchange remained unheard, the efficiency of it made one thing clear: this was not an improvisation, it was a continuation. Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as the situation moved further away from him. But the sense of unease remained, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of how much he had misunderstood and how confidently he had acted on that misunderstanding. He took a step back, then another, creating physical distance that mirrored the shift already happening internally. And as he turned slightly toward the direction he had originally been heading, he hesitated for just a moment, looking back one last time. In that brief glance, he saw Alicia pause near the corridor, her attention shifting for a fraction of a second toward a point further ahead, and in that instant, another individual stepped into alignment from the opposite direction, their movement seamless, their presence blending into the environment while still clearly part of the same coordinated effort. The officers who had remained behind exchanged a brief look, a silent confirmation that everything was proceeding as expected, and then began to disengage from the scene entirely, their posture relaxing as they returned to their routine duties, leaving no visible trace of the tension that had existed just minutes before. Ryan stood there for a second longer, the noise of the concourse gradually filling the space that had been occupied by his assumptions, and as he finally turned away, the realization settled in fully, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet understanding that carried more weight than anything dramatic could have, that what he had believed to be a moment of awareness had actually been a moment of interference, and that the true nature of what he had stepped into was something far more structured, far more deliberate, and far beyond the surface impressions he had trusted. Ahead, Alicia resumed her movement without hesitation, her path now clearly defined, her role fully active, and as she disappeared into the flow of the terminal, the operation continued forward exactly as intended, leaving behind nothing more than a subtle shift. In perspective for the one person who had briefly tried to change its course, Alicia did not slow down as she entered the corridor leading toward the terminal gates, the lighting shifting slightly overhead as the open concourse narrowed into a more structured passage, and with that shift, the movement around her became even more controlled, even more deliberate, though still invisible to anyone not trained to see it. The man walking beside her adjusted his pace to match hers exactly, not leading, not following, but maintaining a position that allowed both proximity and awareness, and as they moved, another individual appeared ahead, blending seamlessly into the flow of travelers before subtly aligning with their trajectory, forming a quiet triangle of coordination that closed distance without drawing attention. Alicia's gaze moved briefly across each of them, not lingering, just confirming presence, confirming timing, and when she spoke, her voice was low and precise, stating that the delay at the concourse had shifted the window by approximately 2 minutes, but that the target pattern should still hold based on prior observation, her words carrying clarity without urgency, as if she had already recalibrated before anyone else needed to. The man beside her responded just as quietly, acknowledging the adjustment and confirming that the secondary team was already repositioning ahead, his tone efficient, his words measured, and in that exchange the full structure of the operation began to reveal itself, not through explanation but through coordination. They reached a junction where the corridor split toward multiple gate clusters, and Alicia paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning not the signs overhead but the movement of people passing through, identifying patterns within the crowd, subtle repetitions, deviations that would mean nothing to an ordinary observer but carried significance in her assessment. Then she shifted direction slightly, angling toward a seating area near Gate 22, her movement smooth, unforced, and immediately mirrored by the individuals around her, each one adjusting position in a way that maintained coverage without creating a visible formation. The ambient noise of the terminal continued uninterrupted, boarding announcements echoing softly, the hum of conversation blending into a constant backdrop, and within that normalcy, the operation advanced without disruption. Alicia reached the edge of the seating area and slowed just enough to allow a family with rolling luggage to pass in front of her, using the moment to observe a man seated near a charging station, his posture relaxed but his attention shifting just slightly too often toward the corridor behind her. A detail small enough to disappear in the crowd, but distinct enough to stand out against the pattern she had been tracking. She did not stop, did not react outwardly, but as she moved past, her voice lowered again, describing the individual in precise terms, clothing, position, behavioral cues, all delivered in a steady cadence that allowed the others to confirm without needing to look directly. The man beside her responded with a brief acknowledgement, and ahead, the third individual adjusted his path, creating a line of sight that intersected naturally with the seated man without drawing attention. Alicia continued forward, then slowed again near a digital display, her reflection briefly aligning with the glass in a way that allowed her to observe without turning, confirming that the pattern held, that the subtle signals matched what had been anticipated. Behind them, the structure tightened further, not visibly, but in the way positions locked into place, each person now operating within a defined role that required no additional instruction. Alicia took one more step, then another, closing the final few feet that would bring her into direct proximity with the seated man, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, and in that moment, everything that had unfolded since the concourse converged into a single point of execution. She reached the edge of the charging station area and paused just long enough to allow the timing to align, her voice silent now, her attention focused entirely forward, and as the man beside her shifted slightly to create space, the final phase of the operation began to move into place, not with force, not with urgency, but with the quiet precision of something that had been planned down to the smallest detail, unfolding exactly as intended despite the interruption that had briefly threatened to alter its course. Alicia stood at the edge of the charging station area for a fraction longer than anyone else would notice, her stillness blending into the natural pauses of a busy terminal. Yet every second was measured, every movement around her accounted for, and when she finally stepped forward, it was not a decision made in the moment, but the continuation of a sequence already set in motion. The man seated near the charging station remained in place, his attention shifting intermittently toward the corridor behind her, unaware that the pattern he believed to be subtle had already been identified, tracked, and confirmed across multiple points of observation. Alicia approached without hesitation, her posture relaxed, her pace unremarkable, and as she reached a position just within his peripheral awareness, she paused briefly as if checking something on her phone, creating a natural reason to occupy the space without raising suspicion. The individual positioned ahead adjusted slightly, closing the angle from the opposite side, while the man who had been walking beside Alicia shifted behind her just enough to create a quiet boundary, forming a controlled environment that remained invisible to the surrounding crowd. Alicia lifted her gaze and addressed the seated man in a calm, neutral tone, asking a simple question about the nearest boarding gate, her voice carrying no accusation, no urgency, just enough engagement to draw his full attention. The man looked up, responding casually, but in that moment of eye contact, Alicia observed the subtle cues she had been anticipating, the micro-hesitation, the brief shift in focus that confirmed recognition of something beyond the surface interaction. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his response, and then introduced a second question, equally neutral, extending the interaction just long enough for the positions around them to finalize. The individual ahead took a small step closer, aligning within conversational distance, while another figure approached from the side, appearing to be just another traveler moving through the space. Yet each movement was synchronized with the timing Alicia had set. The man seated at the charging station began to adjust his posture, a subtle sign of awareness that the situation around him was no longer entirely ordinary. But before that awareness could fully form into action, Alicia shifted the tone of the interaction, her voice lowering slightly, her words precise, informing him quietly that she needed him to remain seated and that there were a few questions that required his cooperation. There was no raised voice, no visible escalation, just a change in clarity that reframed the moment entirely. The man hesitated, his eyes moving briefly toward the surrounding space, and in that glance he would have seen nothing unusual, just travelers, seating areas, the normal flow of an airport. Yet within that normalcy, every angle was now accounted for, every path subtly managed. Alicia maintained eye contact, her expression steady, giving no indication of pressure, yet leaving no ambiguity in her words. And after a brief pause, the man nodded slightly, the decision made not through force but through the realization that the situation had already been structured beyond his control. The individuals around them held their positions, not closing in, not drawing attention, but ensuring that the interaction remained contained. And as Alicia continued speaking in a low, even tone, outlining the next steps, the operation reached its point of completion. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden movements, only a quiet transition from observation to resolution, carried out with precision that left the surrounding environment undisturbed. A nearby announcement echoed overhead, boarding for another flight beginning at a distant gate, and the sound blended seamlessly into the moment, masking the significance of what had just occurred. Alicia gave a final nod, signaling that the immediate phase was complete, and the individuals around her adjusted once more, their roles shifting from active engagement to controlled follow-through, maintaining presence without disruption. The man at the charging station remained seated, now fully aware that the interaction had moved beyond casual conversation, yet the calm structure around him left little room for uncertainty. Alicia stepped back slightly, her posture returning to neutral, her focus already moving ahead to the next phase. And as the flow of the terminal continued uninterrupted, the operation concluded its most critical moment without spectacle, leaving behind nothing more than a subtle shift in the pattern of movement that only those involved would ever recognize. The moment settled without spectacle, and that was exactly why it worked, because nothing about what had just happened demanded attention from the people moving through the terminal. No raised voices, no sudden movement, just a quiet shift in the pattern that most would never register. And as Alicia stepped slightly away from the charging station, her posture relaxed into something indistinguishable from any other traveler pausing between gates. Yet her awareness remained fully engaged, tracking every position, every timing cue, every subtle signal that confirmed the operation had transitioned into its final phase. The man who had been seated remained where he was, no longer scanning the crowd with the same restless rhythm, his attention now anchored in the controlled space that had formed around him, and though nothing visible restrained him, the structure itself was enough. The calm clarity of the interaction leaving little room for uncertainty about what came next. The individual who had approached from the opposite side shifted his stance slightly, his focus outward now, ensuring that the surrounding environment remained undisturbed, while the man who had walked beside Alicia earlier moved just enough to create a natural path away from the seating area, a quiet invitation for the next step without drawing attention. Alicia glanced once more at the seated man, her expression neutral, and spoke in a tone that remained even and composed, indicating that they would be moving to a different area to continue the conversation, her words carrying no urgency, yet leaving no ambiguity. And after a brief pause, the man nodded again, the decision reaffirmed not through pressure, but through the steady certainty of the situation around him. They stood almost in unison, the motion blending into the normal flow of people, adjusting positions, gathering belongings, preparing to move, and within seconds, they were walking, not in a tight formation, not in a way that would signal anything unusual, but with a spacing that maintained awareness from every angle. The corridor ahead opened slightly toward a quieter section near a secondary checkpoint, and as they moved in that direction, the individuals who had formed the structure adjusted once more, their roles shifting seamlessly, some moving ahead, others falling slightly behind, each maintaining the balance between visibility and discretion that defined the entire operation. Alicia walked at a steady pace, neither leading too far ahead nor falling back, her position centered within the movement, her attention already beginning to transition beyond the immediate interaction, because for her, this was not an ending. It was a continuation of a larger sequence that extended beyond this single moment. Behind them, the seating area returned to its previous rhythm, new travelers taking the now empty spots, conversations resuming, the brief alignment of events dissolving into the background of everyday movement, leaving no visible trace of what had just occurred. Across the concourse, far removed from where the operation had concluded, Ryan had already moved on, his steps slower than before, his mind still processing the quiet unraveling of his assumptions. And though he was no longer part of the scene, the shift in perspective remained with him, a realization that what seemed obvious on the surface could conceal layers of intention and coordination far beyond immediate understanding. Alicia and the team continued forward, their presence gradually blending back into the flow of the terminal, each step measured, each position intentional, until even they became indistinguishable from the surrounding crowd. The operation no longer visible because it no longer needed to be, and as the overhead announcement called another group to board at a nearby gate, the sound carried across the space with the same routine familiarity as always, marking time in a place where thousands of individual stories move past each other every day, most unnoticed, most unremarked, yet occasionally intersecting in ways that revealed just how much could be happening beneath the surface, unseen, deliberate, and executed with a precision that left behind nothing but a quiet, lasting shift in understanding.